Hi there, and welcome to the Resilient Educator. My name is Campbell Stewart. I'm a school social worker with the Beaverton School District, and I'm here with my colleague Dina Schreiner, who's also a school social worker with the Beaverton School District. So, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for even clicking on this training and being willing to tap into this resource. We think that this is a really critical time for all of us to be taking care of ourselves, to be identifying the hard parts of what's going on in our schools and our communities right now, and having some conversations about that, how that shows up for us in our day to day lives, and then what we can do about it. Many of you may have participated in a training like this before. Dean and I have been offering these trainings for the last several years throughout Beaverton School District. It's something we're very passionate about. We think that it's really hard for adults to show up to meet the needs of kids if they aren't showing up as their whole selves and if they're not being cared for. So thank you for being here. If some of this material is a repeat, that's okay. This is a practice. This is something that we have to do every day. And so please know that we recognize that some of this material has been shared, and we want to continue to share it, and we want you to revisit it. So whether it's a self-care wheel, whether it's a mindfulness practice, these are things that are just that. It's a practice and something that we want to work on with you throughout the school year. So I'm going to pass it over to Dina now. We are recording this training together, and she's going to do a little walkthrough on what you can expect for today.
Hi, I'm Dina. I'm the licensed clinical social worker in the Beaverton School District, filming here at Beaverton High School, 6 feet apart from Campbell Stewart. So today, while we're going through this PowerPoint presentation, you can expect to see our faces pop up in some of the screens, and some of the screen will also just have our voices. We invite you to grab a pen and paper to participate with some of the self-reflection activities, and we encourage you to do this with a buddy and or a teammate or a trusted colleague, or encourage others to join you in this work so you're not doing it alone. It is definitely a community process. If you have any questions or any concerns at the end of this presentation, please feel free to reach out to myself or Campbell. We would love to know what the needs of the community are. So if we need to do a deeper dive into things like the self-care piece or the trauma-informed practices or the compassion fatigue, we would love to do so. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel and check out some of the other videos we're posting around resilient education. These can be things like mindfulness or community care. Thanks and enjoy the presentation. Let's start with taking a mindful minute. I invite you to sit in your chairs comfortably. Try to listen and enjoy the 1 minute of mindfulness. Put your feet gently on the floor. Sit up tall, take some big, deep breaths with your diaphragm, and let's begin. Excellent. Thanks for taking time to have a mindful minute. Trauma and self-care. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to take care of yourself first today while listening to this presentation. It can be challenging and bring up big emotions for us while we're talking about these concepts. So please feel free to pause this presentation at your leisure, take a walk, enjoy some outdoor space, maybe a mindful minute, or just enjoy a nice warm cup of tea. Under normal circumstances, these can be very challenging topics to talk about. But now that we're in a global pandemic, it should be noted that we're all in some sort of crisis response and dealing with our own stressors that impact our day to day, our family relationships, and how we're doing our job. Our world has been turned upside down. This presentation is just a brief introduction to these concepts. I invite you to check out our YouTube page and follow up with community care or a mindfulness lesson to deepen your understanding of these concepts. Thank you. Let's take a moment and do a self-reflection. Find a scrap sheet of paper and write down one word or sound, or maybe draw a picture to describe how you feel about self-care. After doing so, give yourself a thumbs up or a thumbs down to indicate how intentional you are with your self-care. If we look at trauma-informed schools and 321 Insight, you will see that our foundation of trauma-informed work is self-care. One key concept of self-care is to look at how working with individuals who have experienced trauma can impact the work we do and how we take care of ourselves so we can continue to do this hard work. So often we become accustomed to seeing, hearing, witnessing stress, trauma, crisis, and it starts to impact us without us even noticing it's taking a toll. Our trauma exposure response is the transformation that takes place within us as a result of this exposure. We know that trauma is not an event itself, but rather a response to one or more overly overwhelming, stressful events where one's ability to cope is overwhelmed. It means that we might experience a stressful event and feel that it has threatened our health and safety. What is traumatic to one may not be traumatic for another. If we as educators are working with suffering people and environments in a sustainable way, we must understand how our work affects us. One major effect is through experiencing compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue has also been known as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. It's the emotional residue or strain of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. Now, it should be noted that this is very different than burnout, but can coexist. Compassion fatigue can occur due to exposure on one case, or it can be due to a cumulative level of trauma, or even as a result of working within an oppressive system. Burnout is very different. Burnout is the stress of the daily grind, and it results in emotional exhaustion and withdrawal associated with increased workload and institutional stress. Burnout does not account for the trauma exposure.
We have a working definition of compassion fatigue. We're going to take some time to talk about how do we know if we're experiencing that? What might that actually look like in our day-to-day lives? So the visual that you have before you is from trauma stewardship. And this is a trauma exposure response wheel, is what we call it. And this lists 16 different symptoms that you may or may not experience on a daily basis that sort of would indicate some level of a trauma exposure. And you may experience more than one of these and at varying levels. And so there's no sort of right or wrong in this. It's just something to help build our awareness. So I want you all to just sort of look through this, and I'll give some examples of how this might show up for you. So a common one is the feeling helpless or hopeless. That's just that sense that no matter what I do, it may not really make a change. Another common one is the inability to empathize or numbing. And so maybe you have a situation that in the past would have really evoked a strong empathetic response, but you're just feeling like you can't really absorb that experience. We talk about just that idea of being a sponge that hasn't been wrung out and just can't take any more on. Another experience that I think many of us are feeling right now is sort of a deep chronic exhaustion. And when we talk about exhaustion, we don't mean just like, well, I'm feeling kind of tired or a tired that can be remedied with a good night's rest. It's really more chronic. And even if you get a good night's rest or many good nights' rest, you can kind of still wake up feeling pretty tired. And in this time of collective grief and collective trauma that we're all experiencing, or many of us are experiencing during this pandemic, um, the chronic exhaustion is coming up a lot more, layered with the screen fatigue that many of us are feeling. So just something to be aware of and pay attention to. Another one that we often get questions about is, what does a dissociative moment mean? And that's really just when you are in a moment and you feel like your body is there, but your mind is someplace else, or you kind of lose track of time and space. We use the example that sometimes people will drive home from work and they won't really remember the drive. Um, and so that's just an example of how that can show up in your daily life. So I want to just take a moment to reflect as we're looking at these different trauma exposure responses, that maybe in the past you feel like in your work you've had good ways of coping with some of the things that you're exposed to in your work. But we're in a different situation right now. We're all sort of collectively experiencing um, this community grief and collective trauma um, through this pandemic. So we want to just normalize what some of these exposure responses that you may be feeling, that many of us are feeling now. Um, and also just highlight a couple of terms that you may have heard floating around, things like decision fatigue, morality fatigue, which is really just that exhaustion that comes from constantly having to weigh your decisions and the implications. Are you going to hurt somebody? Is going to the grocery store safe? Is returning to school safe? All those sorts of things that we're constantly having to weigh, and that just contributes to that exhaustion. So I want to give everybody just a moment to reflect on this. And again, if you are doing this as a team, or you have a colleague, a trusted colleague that you can talk about this with, think about, if you identify one of these responses, if you can see that showing up for you, think about, what does that look like for you? How does that impact your work? Or how do you anticipate it impacting your work as we move forward in the school year? How does it impact your family dynamics? And how does it impact your relationships? And maybe just jot a few of those things down. And again, there's no judgment here, no right or wrong. We're just trying to help create some awareness about some of these experiences. And we're going to move into, when we are having these experiences, then now what can we do about it? And how can we take care of ourselves during this time? We're going to introduce a very simple mindfulness practice. We mentioned earlier that we wanted to embed sort of easy practices that you can use on a daily basis, that you could also use in the school setting as well. And this is just a simple stop. So, as the slide says, I want everybody to just stop what you're doing, turn to your breath, observe how you're feeling, and we're going to proceed with what we're doing. I wanted to take a quick moment to go over the mindfulness practice, or the stop activity, just to sort of explain why we use practices like that. So often in our day, we don't take the time to stop and breathe and check in with our body. And when we do that, it gives us the opportunity to reflect on how we're feeling. We do know that deep breathing is very healing for our body. and it can work as a reset for us. It's a wonderful tool to use for yourself, for students, for family members. I'm sure many of you can think of times when you've had somebody in your life who's upset, and one of the first things that we lean on is, okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's slow down, breathe. So, using this practice and modeling this for students or families or anybody that you're working with is a really great way to check in with your body, to slow yourself down, and to reset. So, now what do we do if we have compassion fatigue? Now that we've gone over the vicarious trauma response wheel, we wanted to talk a little bit about self care. I want everybody to go back to the self reflection activity that Dina had you do sort of at the start of this training, where we had to write one word or a sound to describe how you feel about self care. And I want you to think about looking at your response. Some people might write down things like, I feel great about self care. I feel like it's really important. I feel like it's a personal value. Maybe it's exercise. Maybe it's time with friends or family. And those are all great responses. But I want you all to consider that there may be a counter narrative to the term self care. For some people, that may feel like a burden. It may feel like something that they have to do, another thing to add to their to do list. It may evoke feelings of shame if you don't feel like you're doing self care. It may evoke feelings of isolation or something that's not accessible to somebody. So we want you to just consider the privilege that comes with the term self care that we know it in our culture today. And to think about, how do we broaden the view of self care or change the terminology that feels relevant and accessible to you? So, what does it mean when we tell others to take care of themselves? And how do we help others contextualize self care versus offering a hollow platitude? What happens when marginalized groups feel like self care implies that they have the work to do when perhaps it's oppressive systems that need to change and do the caring for them? So, within self care, we can see intersections between race, gender, spirituality, socioeconomic status, physical and social environments, and more. How do we help people tap into their own inner strength and awareness versus leaning on an external resource for healing? So today we're just asking you to consider this and to know that there's no wrong answer for what that term means to you. And if it doesn't feel accessible to you, maybe there is a different term that you use. Maybe it is resilience. Maybe it's emotional management. Maybe it's wellness. There's no right or wrong here. We just want everyone to consider what that term may mean to some and how loaded it can be in our culture. But at the end of the day, we also want people to engage in practices that contribute to their healing and to their wholeness and to being able to show up in this work in your best self.
Self-care is an intentional act and covers 6 domains of our overall health and wellness. The domains are personal, physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and professional. We are a culture of consumption. We consume. We binge watch Netflix, we overeat, we put things into our body in hopes that it will make us feel better. However, we are not doing what is proven to be effective, which is getting rid of this toxic stress that is lingering within our bodies. When our ancestors experienced a stress response due to a threat like a saber-toothed tiger, they would have a physiological response. Stress hormones would flood the system, and all the blood was directed towards their legs, their brain, the large muscles that would help them fight, flight, or freeze. After the threat was over, they would then do an activity that would help them metabolize the hormones and allow their body to return to homeostasis. They would hunt, they would gather, they would eat, they would take a nap, or they would find a mate. Nowadays, our threats are lesser in life-threatening nature, but still elicit the same physiological response and over a prolonged period of time. Behaviors in the classroom, traffic on your way to work, crying children, stress of teaching a lesson, angry parents, frustrated coworkers are just some of the examples of the daily stressors we face. And we're not provided an opportunity to metabolize the stress hormones since a lot of what we do require us to remain in the classroom setting. Once we are home, we may be too tired to do anything but sit down and consume. Our hormones remain in our body and become toxic, resulting in compassion fatigue, and then it becomes a cycle. If I could encourage you to take one simple change today, it would be to take 15 minutes a day to do an activity that would help you metabolize your stress hormones. Ways to release these toxic hormones include having an aerobic activity that is best drains adrenals and cortisol levels, like taking a brisk walk or doing a couple jumping jacks just to get us sweating. Practicing mindfulness, drinking a large glass of water. This is particularly helpful if we're trapped in a classroom, teaching a lesson, and needing to drain some of the hormones that are flowing through our body. Deep breathing, laughing, practicing gratitude, or picking up a hobby. Some of these can be incorporated in your classroom setting to help regulate other students and yourself. Self-care wheel is a great visual representation of the low-cost, no-cost activities you can do to self-soothe and do some form of self-care. This document comes from the Trauma Stewardship and is a great resource. If you take a closer look, you can find some really good ideas. For example, think about your positive qualities under the psychological domain. There's also spiritual. You could find a spiritual mentor, volunteer for a cause that you believe in, or personal. Cook out, learn a new recipe, learn a new skill like playing the guitar, or just relax, write a poem, or read a little excerpt from a book. All of these things can be found within your home and easy to access. Take a look and try. Now we're going to move into how to assess your life balance and end with an activity. A great way to assess your self-care is to create a SMART plan and using a tool to assess what you are doing well and what areas could be using some consideration. Frequently, we make assumptions about how we were taking care of ourselves. Sometimes we tell ourselves stories just to justify and normalize the things we are doing that aren't healthy for us, but we do it out of a sake of survival. A good way to assess how we are doing is to check in regularly without judgment. We're going to tour this website for assessing your. Now that you've clicked on the link, we're going to look at the document Assessing Your Life Balance. This wheel is a great visual representation and also is color-coded to show us the areas in which we are doing pretty well in and maybe some areas for consideration. As you can see, each heading is correlated with a color. So pause the video and go grab your favorite markers, crayons, or colored pencils to participate in this activity. You're going to go to slide 2 or page 2 to see the sections and statements. So follow me here on physical. Find your orange crayon marker or colored pencil and answer this question. I eat a balanced nutritional diet. You will come up here to the physical section and color from the center and work your way out. So if you're about 50% of the time, you're going to color to the 50%. If you're more like 80 to 95, you're doing pretty well and you can color all the way to the top. You're going to do this for each question with each corresponding color. After you completed your circle, you're going to then move on to your plan and do some self-reflection. You're going to notice which sections have the most color, which sections have the least color. What would you like to change about your wheel? And then you're going to set some goals. I always like to tell people that this wheel is meant to be a tool, not a shame-inducing activity. So often we feel like we're not enough. The first words we say when we get up tend to be, man, I didn't even sleep enough. And we want to shift that. We want to be okay with whatever our wheel tells us. So I'm going to invite you to do this without judgment. And if you feel the judgment popping up, it is okay to take a deep breath and lean in and say, this is neither good nor bad. It just is. Another point I'd like to point out is that coloring is a great way to provide our brain with a mindful activity and a break. This activates the soothing centers of our brain center, and it helps us regulate, remain focused on a singular task, and also helps change our brain wave lengths. This will make us relax, become more creative, and open to more ideas. So take a moment, color your wheel, or proceed with the presentation and save this wheel for a later date. I will say, I like to do this wheel about 3 times a year, at the beginning of the school year, around New Year's, and at the end of the school year. I find that my wheel changes quite frequently based off of my stress levels, my workload, or the season, and that this is a living document that will change just like the elements of my.
Now that we're wrapping up, we want to leave you all with some resources that you can look over that help to inform this presentation and have a lot of really good information that you might find helpful. Dina and I mentioned several times Trauma Stewardship, which is a really great book and resource for anybody in a helping profession. Onward is also a resource that you could perhaps use within your school building or within your team or your department. It's broken up into months, so it's very digestible in that you can read one chapter a month, so you don't feel like you have to read this entire book. And it also has a workbook with a lot of really great activities. And then Take Time for You really helps to guide you in actualizing like a self-care plan. And also the Resilient Practitioner talks about burnout prevention and strategies for that work as well. I also wanted to mention a couple of other books. Your Caring Heart, which is a renewal for helping professionals and systems by Jaya John. This is a really tender and beautiful book, and I'm going to read a passage at the end to leave you all with that I just highly recommend if you're looking for something that's a little less practical in terms of giving you skills, but it's just a really great source of comfort. And then another book by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky, her newest book, The Age of Overwhelm, Strategies for the Long Haul. Again, fabulous resource and very timely for what we're going through. And I think many of you would find it very helpful. And if you have questions about any of these resources or you're looking for other resources, particularly around resilience or self-care, feel free to reach out to your school social worker and they can give you some additional resources. In addition to the book resources I mentioned, we wanted to share some technology resources that can be helpful. We know that many of us are very screen fatigued right now, so I want to be mindful of that and encourage you to use this if it feels helpful. You know, getting started with a mindfulness or meditation practice can feel overwhelming, or getting started with really trying to hone a gratitude practice. And so these apps can be good at helping to get you started and to keep you accountable. If you want to kind of look back and reflect on how much time you're spending doing, a meditation practice. And if you notice that, wow, this week I used this app 5 times to do a meditation, and I noticed that I was feeling a lot more calm and feeling a lot more present, it can just reinforce that learning or reinforce that maybe this is a skill that's helpful. So here are a few resources that might be helpful just in terms of introducing you to some of these concepts. Well, in closing, we wanted to thank you for your time today, for your interest, for your participation, and we hope that this is helpful and supportive. And like we've mentioned before, feel free to reach out at any time if this interests you or if you want to learn more. We're here to support all of our schools and this work. In closing, I'm going to read a passage from the book that I mentioned, Your Caring Heart by Jaya John. There's this thing you do where you care deeply enough to help people in a way that honors their humanity. I love you for that. After all, you are human. The pain and suffering of others enters you. Too often it stays, or worse, it grows. Society does not sufficiently celebrate, compensate, or care for you. When tragedy strikes, you are frequently the first blamed. Often you fail to receive the sensitivity and understanding you dearly need, even from family and friends. You are under enormous stress with actual lives in your hands, and you also tend to be of a deeply caring nature. So much so that you have a tendency to neglect your own well being. Here's the thing: we need you. You keep our human lotus blossom, our compassion afloat.